a little girl stopped a mafia wedding with 6 words: "Don't marry her." Lorenzo Duca was seconds away from putting his mother's diamond ring on Vivian Moretti's finger when a 7-year-old girl ran barefoot down the aisle. 32 guns turned on her at once. 300 criminals, judges, senators, and dons watched in silence. But Sophia Bennett didn't cry, didn't run, and pointed straight at the bride. "She killed my daddy," she said. And in that moment, the most powerful wedding in Long Island became a crime scene. Today, you and I are going to unpack a rather fascinating clinical study of power and pathology. We begin on a sprawling Long Island estate, bathed in an autumnal light that masked the underlying psychological rot. 2,000 imported white roses and 300 hand-poured hair candles created an atmosphere designed purely to enforce submission. At the center of this engineered reality stood Lorenzo Duca. At 37, he was the youngest apex predator in the syndicate's history. He stood at the altar in a custom black tuxedo, looking less like a groom and more like a megalomaniac narcissist preparing for his coronation. It teaches us a very simple lesson: the harder a man works to control his physical surroundings, the more terrified he is of his own internal chaos. His physical presentation was an immaculate armor. His hair was slicked back, his jaw clean-shaven, and his eyes, a cold, slate gray, were utterly devoid of standard human empathy. Clinically speaking, a flat effect often serves to conceal severe antisocial traits. Hidden in his right palm was a platinum band holding a 5-carat diamond. This was not a symbol of affection. It was an artifact of generational trauma passed down from women who had internalized the violent dynamics of the men who controlled them. Across the manicured lawn, 300 guests sat in rigid, perfectly spaced arcs. These were the apex predators of Chicago and Las Vegas. They project power, but here is a basic truth: inherited trauma never skips a generation unless someone forces it to stop. We observe a striking display of cognitive dissonance among the attendees. A syndicate captain from Palermo conversed with a federal judge, while lawmakers and widows of ruthlessly violent men sipped champagne. They wore masks of polite joy, but their amygdalas were firing constantly. No one truly relaxed here. The perimeter was secured by 32 armed guards in formal wear. They moved with the hyper-vigilant precision of men who understood that a single lapse in attention meant death. They wore earpieces and checked their watches in a compulsive rhythm. Beneath the expensive fabric lay the cold reality of concealed firearms. It shows us a simple fact about human nature: no amount of wealth or social status can ever buy a nervous system that is truly at peace. These guards provided the illusion of safety required to keep the guests compliant. Beside the groom stood Vincent Russo, a 55-year-old advisor whose entire adult life had been defined by high-stakes survival. His steady hands belied the chronic stress ravaging his internal systems. A psychotic tightness gripped his chest, a classic physical manifestation of impending threat, though he refused to analyze it. Then, the auditory stimulus shifted. A string quartet began playing a traditional Sicilian melody, prompting a mass physiological response as heads turned. Vivian Moretti materialized at the top of the aisle, draped in ivory silk. It is a harsh but useful lesson ignoring. What your body tries to tell you never stops the threat from actually arriving. Vivian had carefully constructed her external image, pearls threaded through her hair, her veil motionless in the heavy air. She walked alone, a calculated choice to project autonomy within a system that allowed none. Her measured steps and practiced smiles suggested a high degree of sociopathic masking. She was almost too flawless to be genuine. Lorenzo observed her approach, his thumb rhythmically stroking the ring, a self-thing behavior. But outside the boundaries of this strictly controlled environment, a frantic, rhythmic sound broke through the conditioned silence. It was the rapid strike of patent leather shoes on stone. The lesson here is quite clear: the most perfectly polished facades are almost always hiding the most dangerous psychological fractures. Before the crowd could process the anomaly, Cognitive bias led them to assume it was merely an errant child. Indulgent smiles formed, an automatic social reflex, but those masks dropped the moment the subject came into full view. This was no flower girl. She was perhaps 7 years old, wearing a simple blue dress that sharply contrasted with the opulence. Her clothes were soiled, her shoes scuffed. Her unevenly braided hair indicated a state of domestic distress. Her physical symptoms, flushed skin and rapid breathing, pointed to extreme acute stress. Yet her eyes remained remarkably fixated. It proves a profound psychological truth: a child forced to carry the weight of severe trauma will often display more steady resolve than a room full of seasoned killers. The subject possessed absolute clarity of purpose. Her voice sliced through the heavy air, bypassing decades of conditioned social protocol. "Don't marry her," the little girl shouted. "Please, Zuka, don't marry her." The environmental response to her verbal trigger was immediate and violently disproportionate. 32 armed men reacted as a single organism driven by the brainstem. Jackets swept open. Weapons were drawn in a terrifyingly synchronized motion. The mechanical sounds of 32 slides racking echoed across the garden. A brutal confirmation of underlying lethality. The guests experienced a spike in cortisol, a basic rule of human behavior when people live their entire lives anticipating violence. They draw a weapon on a shadow if it moves too fast. The collective panic rippled outward. High-ranking syndicate members dropped behind their chairs, reverting to ingrained survival tactics with weapons drawn. Shattering champagne glass punctuated the sudden shift from celebration to crisis. Yet, the young subject, Sophia Bennett, displayed a profound lack of physiological reactivity. She did not flinch, cry, or attempt to flee. She stood surrounded by lethal force, her gaze locked onto the groom. Lorenzo mirrored her stillness. As a man conditioned by a lifetime of violence, his prefrontal cortex bypassed panic entirely. He analyzed the spatial data and realized the truth. Look, we can all learn from this moment sometimes. The most powerful thing you can do when surrounded by absolute chaos is to simply refuse to move. He employed a universal gesture of de-escalation, slowly raising an open hand. "Stand down," he said. His command was delivered without raising his volume, a clear indicator of absolute authority. The guards physically lowered their weapons, signaling compliance. Vincent Russo confirmed the order with a nod. Meanwhile, Vivian experienced a massive physiological shift. The blood drained from her face, an autonomic reaction to sudden stress. Vivian quickly attempted to rebuild her psychological mask, forcing a confused smile. "Lorenzo," she said. "Who is this child? What is she doing here?" A fascinating reality of behavior. True power does not need to shout, and true fear cannot be hidden, no matter how hard someone tries to force a smile. Sophia did not address the groom. She redirected her focus to Vivian, raising a small arm with the steady precision of a trained marksman. She clearly identified the bride as the source of her profound trauma. "She destroyed my family," Sophia said. "She killed my daddy." The environmental reaction was a complete systemic freeze. The polite silence of the ceremony morphed into the paralyzing stillness of a collective shock state. The wind seemed to vanish, and the flickering candles froze, mirroring the suspended respiration of the 300 guests. The lesson is undeniable and severe. The weight of a guilty conscience is so heavy that a single, spoken truth can suck the oxygen out of a massive network of lies. It was the megalomaniac narcissist who finally broke the paralysis. Lorenzo completely ignored his bride and the officiating priest, who was displaying classic avoidance behavior by clutching his book like a physical shield. Lorenzo's focus remained entirely locked on the trauma subject. He abandoned his position dominance at the altar. He walked backward down the aisle at a deliberate subversion of ceremonial norms, until he reached the child. Then, in full view of the most dangerous individuals in the region, the apex predator dropped to one knee. This physical lowering was a calculated display of controlled empathy. Life teaches us this constantly. The strongest individuals are not the ones who stand above the broken, but the ones willing to kneel down beside them. Vivian's facade instantly shattered, revealing the frantic, demanding tone of a narcissist losing control. "Lorenzo, this is absurd," Vivian said. "Get up. You can't possibly be listening to this." Lorenzo did not turn his head. Quiet. A single, dominant word was all it took to silence her desperate attempt at psychological manipulation. At this close proximity, Lorenzo could observe the child's somatic symptoms. Sophia's small shoulders trembled, and her hands gripped a tiny cloth purse, as if it were a crucial anchor. Yet her dark eyes maintained intense, unapologetic contact. A simple truth about human connection: when you strip away the social noise, genuine eye contact between two damaged people speaks louder than any threat or command. You and I can observe how effectively he deployed clinical empathy. "What's your name?" Lorenzo asked. "Sophia," she whispered. "Sophia Bennett," he echoed it back to her. "Do you know who I am?" "You're Mr. Duca." "That's right," he said. "Did you come here to show me something?" Her physical response shifted, from frozen dissociation to goal-oriented action. Her fine motor skills were compromised by adrenaline, causing her fingers to fumble repeatedly with the brass clasp of her purse. Finally, she managed to open it. With the absolute care of someone handling a priceless artifact, she withdrew a single, folded object. It was a photograph. The final simple lesson is this: no matter how deeply you bury your past, the evidence always finds you. Let us open this case file together, you and I. We always start with the physical evidence. The Polaroid was deteriorating, its white borders yellowed, the corners curling from the desperate grip of a child, seeking comfort in trauma. Sophia unfolded it with the hypervigilance I often see in victims of severe psychological abuse. Lorenzo took it gently. The image was amateur, captured across an asphalt lot in a bleached afternoon light that washed out the background but highlighted the pathology. Two subjects stood by a sedan. The female subject was younger, her hair longer, but the bone structure, the rigid jawline, that calculating mouth, it was unmistakable. Trauma leaves a permanent record, and so does the predator. The male subject beside her, roughly 35 with broad shoulders, displayed the tragic, relieved smile of a man who believed his life had just been saved. It is a textbook trauma bond. "That is my daddy," Sophia whispered, her voice fractured by grief. "His name was Marcus Bennett." At the altar, Vivian inhaled, a microscopic shift in respiration. A sociopath's only leak is often physiological. To an untrained ear, it was nothing. But Vincent Russo, a man whose baseline is high-alert paranoia, caught it instantly, his gaze locked onto her face. Lorenzo lifted his head, his posture shifting from romantic compliance to predatory stillness as he looked up the aisle at the bride in ivory silk. "The body always betrays the mind." "You knew that name," he stated. Vivian's smile immediately shattered into a brittle, performed mask. "Lorenzo, I have no idea what you are talking about," she lied, deploying the classic gaslighting tactic of a cornered narcissist. Lorenzo studied the photograph, processing Marcus Bennett's foolishly hopeful grin and the woman beside him. "I have watched hardened killers break down during interrogations, and it looks exactly like what happened next." Lorenzo's fingers crushed the Polaroid, every knuckle turning bone white. Vivian registered his physiological shift before she looked at his face. Recognizing the collapse of her manipulation, she chose the predator's default survival mechanism, which is an unprovoked attack. "Are you really going to ruin our wedding over a random child?" she demanded, projecting her own guilt onto the victim. "Look at her, she is a stranger." Her voice was pitched perfectly to trigger groupthink among the guests. The older syndicate bosses shifted, experiencing collective cognitive dissonance. Vivian had weaponized the environment beautifully. To the 300 guests who missed her physiological tells, her narrative seemed perfectly rational. The most dangerous lies are wrapped in plausible victimhood. Then, Donna Isabella Duca stood up from the front row. At 68, draped in black silk, she moved with the terrifying, unhurried calm of an apex predator asserting dominance in her territory. It was as if the collective respiratory rate of the garden paused, awaiting her cue. Donna Isabella raised one slender hand, palm outward, and the anxious murmuring instantly evaporated. She employed total silence, a power move strictly reserved for those at the top of a dominance hierarchy. As the matriarch who had outlived a husband, 2 brothers, and a son, she had conditioned these 300 violent individuals to submit without a single spoken threat. When her hand went up, America's most lethal men simply sat down and folded their hands. Lorenzo did not even look at her. He felt her psychological shield drop into place behind him, isolating the variables. "Sophia," he asked quietly, remaining on one knee. "Tell me what happened to your father," he instructed, applying a gentle pressure to bypass her trauma block. The child's eyes swelled, but her conditioning kept the tears from falling. "She took Daddy's money," she whispered, "all of it. Then he got hurt. Then he died." The fragmented syntax is typical of early childhood trauma recall. The psychological weight of those simple syllables fractured the air. Suddenly, a door slammed open in the distance. Erratic footsteps slapped against stone, a frantic maternal panic response. Elena Bennett burned into view, an apron still tied around her waist. Acute stress ages the human body rapidly. At merely 32 years old, the sheer terror painted across her face made her look 60. She crossed the lawn in the desperate, uncoordinated strides of a system flooded with adrenaline. "I am so sorry, Mr. Duca," she pleaded, attempting to verbally de-escalate a perceived threat. She slipped away. "Please forgive her." "Stop," Lorenzo commanded. His volume was low, but the vocal tone carried absolute, non-negotiable authority. "Both of you stay." Elena's motor functions froze instantly. Vivian pivoted, her veil trailing like a theatrical prop as she addressed the crowd. "This is a setup," she announced, exhibiting the classic paranoia of a megalomaniac losing control. "Someone planted this child to humiliate me." Vincent Russo materialized at Lorenzo's shoulder, silent and inevitable as an intrusive thought. "The guests are watching," Vincent murmured, assessing the crowd's baseline anxiety. Lorenzo stood up slowly. He bypassed the social pressure entirely, ignoring the priest and the audience to lock his visual focus on Vivian. He studied her, dismantling her facade piece by piece in his mind. "The wedding," he stated, his voice slicing through the garden's tension like a surgical scalpel, "is cancelled." Mass hysteria instantly infected the garden. 300 voices shattered into gasps, the sudden spike in collective blood pressure palpable in the air. "Watch closely now. You and I are seeing the mask slip entirely." Vivian's voice grew shrill and ragged. "You cannot do this to me," she screamed, suffering a catastrophic narcissistic injury. Mass panic inside a syndicate compound only lasts as long as the apex predators allow. Before Vivian's screech could fully register, Donna Isabella executed her second behavioral anchor, raising her hand once more. The environment instantly recalibrated. 200 armed men folded inward, an organized immune response neutralizing a pathogen. Covert earpieces relayed cold logistics. Pathways formed where none existed moments prior. High-status politicians were physically managed with subtle elbow pressure. Violent men submitted to silent nods. The musicians lowered their bows in synchronized compliance. When Donna Isabella finally spoke, her vocal register was artificially warm, deliberately low, and psychologically impossible to resist. "My friends," she began, executing a slow, calculated rotation, so her eye contact could suppress every sector of the lawn. "Forgive us, but a private matter requires our attention. Please enjoy the dining hall." She employed a masterclass in psychological redirection. She offered no genuine apology, provided zero factual context, and completely erased the trauma that had just occurred on the altar. Grabbed his shirt. She simply reprogrammed 300 individuals, pivoting their reality from a shattered wedding into a mandatory banquet. And the most ruthless men on the eastern seaboard marched inside, like obedient schoolchildren. Real power is never loud. It is a conditioned reflex beaten into a population over 40 years of steady, systematic control. Vivian remained frozen at the altar, abruptly flanked by 2 of Vincent's operators. They did not initiate physical contact. The spatial intimidation was sufficient. "Miss Morady," one murmured, deliberately stripping her of the duca name she craved. "Please come with us to the East Room." "I am the bride," she hissed, her cognitive dissonance outright refusing to process her sudden demotion. "Yes, miss," the operator replied, feeding her delusion just enough to ensure physical compliance. She marched away, her chin raised in a pathetic display of grandiosity, her veil trailing like the ruined flag of a conquered regime. Lorenzo did not even track her exit. He was already moving toward the estate, pulling the traumatized child into his orbit. Elena's free hand twitched upward in repetitive, involuntary spasms, a nervous tic born from years of apologizing to abusers who were no longer there. They entered the study, a heavily insulated sensory deprivation chamber constructed of dark walnut and oxblood leather. Lorenzo secured the door, completely isolating them from the external chaos. He dropped to one knee on the rug, forcing himself below the child's eye level to remove his own physical threat posture. "You are safe here," he stated, establishing a new baseline of reality. "No one will hurt you." The moment Sophia cognitively processed that safety, her neurological dam broke, her tiny facial muscles collapsed, and the repressed agony finally expelled itself in violent sobs. Mommy said, "Never tell anyone," she wept, revealing the explicit threat conditioning that kept them paralyzed. "Mommy said it would get us killed. But I had to." Lorenzo applied a physical anchor, brushing one knuckle gently against her face. "You did the right thing," he validated, rewriting her guilt narrative. Beside them, Elena cried without making a sound, the learned behavior of prey. "You and I have seen this exact silent weeping in maximum security trauma wards." Lorenzo placed her in a chair, handing her water. "Tell me about your husband," he prompted. The history bled out in disjointed traumatic fragments. A Boston surplus dealer, a woman in a green dress, rapid financial drain, the total destruction of an innocent family unit. Today, you and I are going to open a rather disturbing case file together. We begin with a textbook erasure. The savings evaporated, the woman vanished, the inevitable phone calls from foreign accents demanding what Marcus owed. Then, the predictable climax, a single-car accident on Route 17 in New Jersey. No skid marks. The body identified solely by a wedding ring. Classic isolation and elimination. Lorenzo listened to this clinical sequence of destruction without interrupting. When the recitation ended, he moved to the door, opening it just a fraction. Vincent, the veteran consigliere, waited in the hall. "Find out everything about Vivian Moretti," Lorenzo instructed with the cold precision of a surgeon. "Real history, financial ties, passports, prior associations." Vincent nodded, an untraceable phone already active in his hand. Lorenzo secured the door and returned to his desk, sliding the photograph beneath the glare of a green-shaded lamp. To an analyst, physical artifacts are psychological footprints. He turned the image over, pressed into the yellowed paper. It was a desperate anchor to reality, a faded pencil inscription reading, "For Sophia, from Marcus, September 14th. Beneath that tender dedication lay the true pathology. In different ink, a single name had been printed, and then violently half-erased. It is a classic manifestation of a predator's arrogance, the compulsive need to leave a signature. Lorenzo leaned in. The ghosted letters spelled Salvatore. A megalomaniac narcissist rarely allows their destruction to remain entirely anonymous. Lorenzo, nay, did not linger at the desk for long. The faded letters on the photograph could wait. The traumatized mother and child in his armchair required immediate stabilization. Lorenzo slipped the Polaroid into his jacket, killed the lamp, and softly asked them to follow. They descended a concealed back staircase, a path Lorenzo had avoided since he was 12. It opened into a forgotten corridor lined with generational portraits of the estate's domestic staff. It is fascinating how the human brain compartmentalizes an environment. He had bypassed this hallway 1,000 times without consciously registering its existence. Tonight, his psychological blinders were removed. He finally saw the hidden infrastructure of his own domain as they emerged into the main kitchen. Heavy, with comforting heat. Overhead, heavy copper pots clung to a rack, while the butcher block remained dusted with flour. the residue of Elena's routine before her daughter's voice shattered her equilibrium. Down the hall, the wedding banquet was being plated, but this quiet room was Elena's territorial safe zone. She gravitated toward it on pure survival instinct, seeking the grounding effect of a familiar environment. Her motor functions engaged long before her conscious brain could process the trauma. She ignited the blue gas flame, chamomile with honey for Sophia, strong black tea, devoid of sugar for Lorenzo. It was a brilliant display of subconscious hypervigilance. Her brain had silently cataloged his exact preferences over 2 years of serving him, despite him never once truly looking at her. Lorenzo sat at the scarred work table, a space he had never occupied before. Clinically, he found this grounded reality far more tolerable than his curated dining room. Beside him, Sophia contracted into a defensive posture, pressing a worn gray bear to her chest as a psychological shield. "Tell me from the beginning," Lorenzo prompted. Elena anchored her hands to the wood. Her vocal cadence was fascinating. She delivered the narrative, exactly like a captive who has developed Stockholm Syndrome, obsessively protecting the memory of her captor while slowly unraveling the truth. Marcus, she explained, had been a completely stable, functional partner for the first 8 years of their marriage. His behavioral baseline was remarkably normal. He dealt in surplus military gear near the Boston Navy Yard. He was integrated into society, coaching preschool soccer, exhibiting clear signs of domestic contentment. He smelled consistently of plain soap and motor oil. Then came the disruption. 4 years ago, a charity benefit completely altered his psychological trajectory. He purchased a tuxedo, stepping outside his standard parameters. When he returned that evening and described a particular woman to Elena, her intuition immediately detected a severe anomaly. She read the subtle physiological shifts in her husband's face. They lacked the clinical vocabulary at the time, but the grooming phase had already commenced. This new woman was a highly calibrated, dangerous deviation from the norm. Notice the textbook execution of this manipulation. For 4 months, Vivian requested absolutely nothing, establishing a false trust. Then came the fabricated scarcity, a reluctant mention of a venture for silent investors. The hook sank deep. It proves a chilling lesson. The most dangerous predators do not break down your door. They wait for you to open it. Under her influence, Marcus dismantled his life. He liquidated his warehouse, vehicle, and home. He secured a fatal loan from a violent operative. Every asset was wired to an account scrawled on a napkin. Then came the discard phase. The account vanished. Vivian's identity evaporated. Predictably, the brutal debt collectors from Providence began materializing at their apartment under the cover of darkness. In a desperate bid for self-preservation, Marcus relocated his family to a Dorchester rental, using Elena's maiden name to sever their footprint. 6 weeks later, a trooper asked Elena to identify a recovered ring. The vehicle had veered off Route 17 at 3 a.m. No evasive maneuvers. A ruptured fuel tank to incinerate the evidence. Elena noted quietly that no one believed it was accidental, but the criminal ecosystem is brutally efficient. Anyone willing to speak up was already neutralized. Driven by the primal need to protect her child, Elena secured employment at the Duca estate 10 months later through a network of parish priests. Naturally, she omitted her husband's lethal debt to the Providence Syndicate. Complete silence was her only viable defense mechanism. Sophia remained rigid, fusing herself to the stuffed bear. Lorenzo analyzed the child before shifting focus to the mother. "Why did Sophia recognize her today?" he inquired, probing for the trigger. Elena's hands gripped the wood, manifesting her repressed panic. "Because Vivian invaded our apartment once," she revealed. An unscheduled breach while Elena was out. It was Sophia who answered the door. Then, the child's voice finally broke the clinical silence. "She smiled at me," Sophia whispered into the fur. But the girl's expression was chillingly flat. "I never forgot her eyes. That is the primal terror of encountering a psychopath. A child's brain instantly registers the predator beneath the human mask." Lorenzo placed his cup down, with deliberate precision. Lorenzo processed the data points. 3 ghosted letters on a photograph. A meticulously engineered wedding. And the woman who seamlessly inserted herself into his reality 4 months prior, mimicking the exact same pattern. She never asked for a single thing. To an analyst, this is not coincidence. This is a method, a repeatable psychological framework for infiltration. Meanwhile, Vincent was executing his investigation. 30 years as a consigliere proved that databases only confirm what the human network already suspects. True intelligence is extracted from whispered conversations with old men in dimly lit rooms. As the banquet commenced, Vincent sat in an unmarked sedan, sliding through the Long Island dusk. He initiated his first encrypted call before the gates locked. He dialed a Palermo contact. The responding voice lacked surprise, a hallmark of men accustomed to sudden crisis. Vincent provided the target variables, Vivian Moretti, and a birth date. The contact exhibited a calculated silence before replying in Sicilian, "I will call back." This is the universal cadence of an ecosystem processing a high-risk query. Vincent initiated a second inquiry to Naples. A third reached an operative in Marseille, a man carrying a psychological debt to Vincent's father since 1981, eager to balance his internal ledger. Each interaction was clinically brief, clocking under 90 seconds. Each concluded with the cautious promise of a return call. Eventually, the sedan parked quietly on an Astoria side street, concealing itself behind a darkened bakery. Vincent descended into a subterranean bar, devoid of signage. The social dynamic here relied on absolute discretion. The bartender offered no greeting, sliding a glass of grappa across the wood and gesturing toward a shadowed booth. The informant occupying the space was deliberately unremarkable. In behavioral profiling, we call this the ultimate camouflage. His identity was irrelevant. His memory was what mattered. "Moretti," Vincent prompted. "There is no Moretti," the gray man countered, his focus locked on his coffee. "Not the one your boss almost married. That entity did not exist prior to 2018. Her paperwork is flawlessly fabricated. A real passport issued in Rome, a pristine Connecticut license, 4 years of immaculate tax filings. Every single document is clinically clean. Everything is clean, Vincent. That is the pathology." Vincent remained silent, allowing the tension to extract data. "A life that pristine," the man stated, "is synthetically constructed, not organically lived." "By whom?" Vincent pressed. The informant finally looked up, his eyes mirroring the flat effect of old wet stone. "There is a name I have repressed for 7 years, he confessed. "But this entire psychological operation you are describing, the calculated wedding, the collateral child, the phantom woman, it bears his exact behavioral signature." "Whose?" Vincent demanded. "Salvatore Vieri." The grappa in Vincent's hand remained perfectly steady, but a severe physiological freeze response gripped his spine. "He is still alive." "More than alive," the informant corrected. "He operates out of Catania. We are about to uncover the anatomy of a systemic psychological takeover." "Vieri does not deploy muscle," the informant explained. "Soldiers leave evidence. Instead, this narcissist deploys deeply conditioned, patient women. They integrate, marry, map vulnerabilities, and unlock the doors from the inside. They operate exactly like a virus. By the time the victim realizes a predator shares their bed, the trap is fully closed. The husband perishes. The wife inherits the empire. Vieri then consumes the wife, absorbing the territory without firing a single bullet." "How many?" Vincent asked. 3 confirmed cases," the man replied. "Roberto Russo in Boston 2019, Frank Marino in Philadelphia 2021, Antonio Greco in Miami last year. It is a flawless pattern of complete dominance. As an analyst of human behavior, I often examine the environmental triggers that precede a massacre. All dead, survived by newly minted widows. Those fractured territories now answered very quietly to katana. Let us examine this clinical baseline together." The informant pushed his empty cup aside, warning Vincent that his boss was designated as the 4th target. Vincent abandoned his grappa, returning to the Duca estate by 10 o'clock. The lavish wedding banquet had been methodically cleared, the final guests ushered away with grave courtesy. Outside, 300 empty chairs sat beneath white, ghostly canopies. Inside, Lorenzo remained paralyzed in his study. The photograph lay untouched beneath a green lamp. We all have an image we stare at too long, trapping ourselves in grief. Vincent sealed the room and delivered the tactical intelligence in 7 sterile sentences. Stick with me, this is where we map the pathology. Lorenzo did not look at his enforcer. How many families has she destroyed? He asked, recognizing Vivian not as a woman, but as a parasite. At least 3, Vincent confirmed. Russo, Marino, Greco, and now, us. Lorenzo turned toward the reinforced glass. Outside, the temperature had plummeted, turning the sky the shade of bruised iron. The environment was technically quiet, but psychologically, it was entirely at war. The lesson here is simple. The most dangerous monsters do not hide in the dark. They stand right beside you in the light, wearing a smile you desperately want to believe. Let us examine the environmental containment Donna Isabella engineered. She isolated Sophia and her mother on the 2nd floor, a calculated distance from their captive, Vivian. The pale blue walls and oversized bed were textbook pacification tactics, complete with untouched food and borrowed nightclothes. When Lorenzo conducted his midnight behavioral check, the mother, Elena, was asleep in an armchair. Notice her posture, hands folded, rigid, terrified to relax. In clinical terms, this is chronic hyperarousal. The subject's nervous systems simply cannot afford the vulnerability of deep sleep. It is a psychological absolute that suppressed trauma will always demand a physical toll on the human body. Lorenzo correctly deduced that waking the mother would trigger an acute stress response, so he focused on the empty bed. He found the child, Sophia, curled on the window seat, clutching a gray bear as a transitional object. She was neither weeping nor resting. She was exhibiting classic hypervigilance, scanning the dark tree line, like a combat veteran expecting an ambush. Lorenzo applied a sound psychological tactic here. He approached silently and sat at the far edge of the bench, offering a non-threatening physical presence. He asked if she was unable to sleep. Her silent, rigid denial was a perfect study in emotional paralysis. Fear, when left untreated, freezes the victim entirely in time. Today, you and I are going to unpack this psychological profile together. Notice how Lorenzo builds rapid therapeutic rapport. "That's all right," he said softly. "Sometimes I can't either." A breeze rattled the glass before the child made her confession. "Can I tell you something about my daddy?" she asked. Lorenzo offered complete validation. "You can tell me anything." She whispered about a secret phone call, how her father waited until her mother was out of the room. He kept repeating his apologies, caught in an agonizing loop of remorse. Then he issued a command. "Tell Mommy Daddy was stupid." It was followed by a sound that defied categorization, the auditory manifestation of pure cognitive dissonance. That tragic call ended with a terminal farewell. "I love you, baby," he said, and the line went dead. Her vocal effect remained entirely flat, an involuntary defense mechanism, shutting down her emotional receptors to survive the abandonment. Lorenzo performed a delicate behavioral test. He placed his palm on the cushion between them, offering physical contact without demanding it. After a prolonged hesitation, her small fingers sought his for neurological regulation. "Sophia," he said very gently, "the day she came to your apartment, the day you opened the door, was she alone?" The child confirmed a male presence loitering just outside in the hallway, validating his operational suspicions. Children process threatening environments with terrifying clarity. "He didn't come in, but I saw him," she stated. Lorenzo probed her memory. "Can you remember what he looked like?" She retrieved the visual data like a witness reconstructing a crime scene. "Old," she said. "Older than her father. Older than Lorenzo." She described a tall subject with graying hair and a distinctive facial marker. She traced a slow line down her own cheek, mimicking a deep scar running from the eye down to the jawbone. It is fascinating to observe how physical violence leaves a map on the human face. Lorenzo experienced an immediate, autonomic nervous system response. The description perfectly matched a phantom from his own surveillance archives. The subject in question was Salvatore Vieri. Lorenzo masked the sudden spike of adrenaline in his bloodstream. "Did he say anything to your daddy?" he asked, keeping his tone perfectly neutral. "He said it later," Sophia answered, confessing to eavesdropping on a different afternoon. She recited the exact phrasing of the psychological manipulation. "You will be rewarded for your loyalty, Mr. Bennett. You have done well." The father had submitted entirely. "Thank you, sir," he replied. And the man simply said, "Soon." It is a textbook grooming dynamic, feeding the victim an illusion of grandiosity and safety, before initiating the inevitable and lethal discard phase. The architectural structure of the conspiracy suddenly crystallized in Lorenzo's prefrontal cortex. Marcus Bennett was never just a random casualty. He was a disposable asset in a sociopathic chess game, a small-time arms dealer lured into the orbit of a megalomaniac narcissist, exploited for his immediate function, and then brutally discarded when his utility expired. The promised reward was nothing more than a quiet execution en route 17 at 3 in the morning. Lorenzo exerted absolute muscular control to prevent his facial micro-expressions from betraying his horror. He gently trapped a heavy quilt around the traumatized child, attempting to artificially recreate the physical safety she had permanently lost. He issued a definitive verbal guarantee to arrest her panic. "Try to sleep now, Piccolola," he said. "Nobody is going to come through that window tonight, I promise you." The psychological reassurance acted as a sedative. Her eyes grew heavier than they had been 10 minutes prior, her neurological hyperarousal collapsing into exhaustion. Lorenzo waited until her respiratory rate dropped into deep sleep before exiting. Only when he was isolated in the darkened corridor did he allow his suppressed aggression to manifest. He clenched his fist with such mechanical force that his knuckles fractured silence. By dawn, the physical environment of the estate mirrored the psychological shift. The illusion of safety was completely stripped away. "Let us look at this piece by piece, shall we?" The estate projected the strained, highly vigilant atmosphere of a subject surviving a severe trauma. Beneath the polished surface, every guard on the perimeter carried heavier weaponry, their coats hanging low to conceal the firearms. At 9 in the morning, the leadership initiated a cognitive lockdown inside the second-floor library. This environment was strictly engineered for secure information processing. Walnut walls, no exterior windows, a single inlaid table, and a mechanical lock controlled by only 3 keys. The psychological weight of the room was enforced by the dead. Oil portraits of Lorenzo's father and grandfather watched the proceedings in absolute, judging silence. He crossed the street, grabbed his shirt. A portrait of a hardened great-uncle who died in 1958 anchored the wall, his painted N eyes seemingly recording every spoken syllable. Donna Isabella commanded the head of the table. She had abandoned her mourning attire for a severe charcoal suit and pearls, weaponizing her 68 years of survival to project an aura of unyielding dominance. Vincent sat to her right, Lorenzo at the foot, with 3 senior lieutenants between them. Lorenzo initiated his clinical briefing. He stripped all emotional resonance from his voice, methodically detailing the surveillance photographs and Elena's testimony. He then mapped out the behavioral hunting patterns as Vince had retrieved from his overseas intelligence gathering. He listed the historical casualties: Russo of Boston, Marino of Philadelphia, Greco of Miami. The final data point was the facial scar the child had traced in the moonlight. The psychological pressure in the room peaked. Donna Isabella placed both hands flat against the mahogany, a deliberate grounding technique before confirming the diagnosis. "Lorenzo," she said quietly, "this is war." She stated that the megalomaniac narcissist Salvatore Vieri had been actively hunting them. The physiological stress responses among the lieutenants were immediate. Stefano Bruni exhibited magical thinking, crossing himself in silence. Carmine Falco succumbed to bruxism, clenching his jaw as his adrenaline spiked. Then, Tommy Castellano cleared his throat. Castellano had operated under the predatory moniker of the Wolf since his 20s. He shifted his weight, allowing a deeply cynical micro-expression to touch the corner of his mouth. "With respect," he said, "all of this is being built on the testimony of a 7-year-old child." Lorenzo immediately defended the subject's humanity. "She has a name," he countered. Tommy smirked. "I am sure she does, boss. But she is a child." He deliberately challenged the prevailing analytical model, pointing out the absurdity of mobilizing an empire based solely on an unverified pediatric memory. He dismissed the trauma as childish fiction, actively testing the structural integrity of the ruling hierarchy to see if the alpha would break. The atmospheric tension in the room snapped. Vincent locked a chilling, predatory gaze onto Tommy. It was a microscopic shift in body language. But Lorenzo and Donna Isabella registered the behavioral threat instantly. Donna Isabella decisively terminated the alpha posturing. "Vivian stays," she commanded. Her vocal tone was soft, but carried absolute finality. She dictated the containment protocol. The captive would remain isolated in the East Wing, with total sensory deprivation. No letters. No phone calls. Stick with me through this final observation. They were not just holding a prisoner. They were preparing to psychologically dissect her. Until the buried truth finally bled out on the table. Examine the group dynamics here. Lorenzo establishes strict environmental control, a classic symptom of the hyper-vigilant dominant personality. He shuts down the estate, isolating the subject. Vivian. Look at the immediate pack hierarchy. Stefano and Carmine submit instantly. Tommy hesitates. A half-second delay in compliance is an eternity in criminal syndicates. It signals a testing of the alpha. Lorenzo mandates absolute lockdown, placing his own loyalists on every door. Nobody moves without his grandmother's explicit consent. The lesson we can draw from this is quite simple. When a person senses sudden danger, their first instinct is always to build a wall. Fear frequently disguises itself as protocol. Tommy engages in subtle insubordination, masking his challenge with a polite tone. This is passive-aggressive probing, testing the boundaries of the new authority figure. Lorenzo's response is a textbook exhibition of dominant non-reaction. He does not yell, he simply stares. In behavioral science, withholding a reaction forces the challenger to sit in their own discomfort. Carmine and Stefano recognize the silent threat and freeze. Tommy quickly retreats teats, his posture shifting to mimic compliance. You and I see this in any high-stakes environment. True power never has to shout to prove it exists. Silence is always the heaviest weapon in a room, and those who wield it rarely lose control. Notice the shift in the room's psychological temperature once the underlings depart. Vincent, the seasoned consigliere, remains seated. His concern regarding Tommy's behavior highlights a fracture in their organizational stability. Meanwhile, they bring Vivian down. Her physical presentation is deeply telling. Dressed in soft cashmere, she projects an image of harmless vulnerability, yet she refuses both food and tea. This is a deliberate starvation of compliance. By rejecting their basic provisions, she maintains an internal locus of control. The life lesson here is stark but true. You can lock a person in a cage, but you can never force them to swallow what you feed them. Defiance often starts in the stomach. Vivian abandons her wedding gown. In clinical terms, she is shedding her manufactured persona. The submissive, attentive bride was merely an adaptation, a survival mechanism tailored for her specific environment. Now, that mask is completely unnecessary. She sits opposite Lorenzo, her posture impeccably neutral, hands folded, ankles crossed. She exhibits zero autonomic arousal, no sweating, no nervous fidgeting. The soft affection she displayed for months has vanished, revealing the baseline sociopathy underneath. It reminds us of a chilling reality about human nature. The people who seem the most perfect are usually just the most practiced. We fall in love with mirrors, reflecting exactly what we want to see. The expression on her face is pure emotional detachment. Lorenzo attempts to apply psychological pressure by placing the photograph of Marcus Bennett on the table. He expects a spike in her stress levels. Instead, Vivian demonstrates remarkable effective blunting. She glances at the dead man without lifting the picture, dismissing him as an unstable alcoholic. She recites the narrative of his suicide with the clinical detachment of a mortician reading a toe tag. Her tone is flat, devoid of empathy or guilt. This is the danger of engaging with a highly organized manipulator. They rewrite history without blinking. The truth is never what actually happened. The truth is simply whatever story they tell with the most conviction. Observe the systematic unveiling of her pattern. Lorenzo signals Vincent, introducing undeniable empirical evidence. 3 additional photographs hit the table, establishing a clear serial timeline. We see Vivienne with Roberto Russo, who supposedly died of a heart attack at 48. Then Frank Marino, drowned shortly after their wedding, leaving her his assets. The escalation is methodical, a classic Black Widow pathology. Each target was carefully selected for their resources, and each termination was masked as a tragic accident. The behavioral lesson is deeply unsettling. Coincidence is a comforting illusion we invent to ignore the presence of a predator. Once a pattern emerges, it is never an accident. The final photograph completes the triad. Antonio Greco, assassinated in his own driveway, his empire immediately absorbed. Vincent steps back, allowing the weight of this cumulative evidence to settle. Yet, observe Vivienne's reaction. She does not look at the victims. She looks at her own hands. The silence in the library stretches out, accompanied only by the ticking clock. Lorenzo uses silence as an interrogation technique, waiting for the psychological pressure to force a confession. He understands a profound psychological concept. Guilt abhors a vacuum. If you stay quiet long enough, a guilty mind will almost always speak, desperately, trying to fill the empty space to escape their own reflection. When the mask finally slips, we do not see fear. We see the sheer boredom of a seasoned psychopath who has run this exact script too many times. Her laughter shifts from the shy, intimate sound Lorenzo knew into something dry and abrasive. She mocks him, demonstrating classic narcissistic superiority. She reveals that every single victim sat across from her with the exact same proof, asking the exact same questions. She feels absolutely no remorse, only mild irritation at his predictability. You and I should take careful note of this moment. True monsters do not hide in the dark, gnashing their teeth. They sit across from you in nice clothes, utterly amused that you thought you were special. She actively diminishes Lorenzo's ego, comparing him unfavorably to his dead predecessors. Antonio Greco figured it out faster, she notes, and it still did not save him. Then she introduces the grand design. 5, perhaps 6 years of calculated grooming. Lorenzo was the ultimate prize, the youngest boss of the 5 families. The other dead men were merely practice runs. She speaks of this prolonged manipulation as if discussing a minor home repair. This is the hallmark of a megalomaniac architect treating human lives as mere stepping stones. The tragic truth of human interaction is right here. Sometimes, the affection you receive is not love at all. It is simply a long, quiet preparation for your destruction. Vivian systematically dismantles his remaining sense of security. She informs him that his sanctuary is an illusion, that the invisible architect of this plot has already infiltrated his innermost circle. He has never been safe. She glances at the clock, timing her psychological strike perfectly. Then, the kinetic reality shatters the academic calm. A massive detonation strikes the north gate, shaking the heavy chandelier above them. Lorenzo's controlled environment collapses in an instant. This perfectly illustrates a core principle of crisis psychology. We spend our lives building fortresses, out of routine and authority, completely blind to the fact that the foundations have already been wired with explosives. The second blast is a shaped breaching charge, a tactical escalation. The auditory environment instantly shifts to pure chaos. Radios flood with overlapping, panicked orders, punctuated by the distinct rhythm of automatic weapons. Lorenzo's fight-or-flight response activates immediately. Vincent issues rapid-fire directives to secure the vulnerable family members, his military training overriding the shock. As Vincent moves out, keying his radio for trusted loyalists only, he makes a critical error. He turns his back on the primary subject. Vivian is left smiling in the center of the room. Here is a lesson paid for in blood. In the middle of a massive existential crisis, never turn your back on the quiet threat sitting right at your table. Lorenzo reverts to his baseline survival conditioning. He retrieves a hidden weapon, a Glock 19, chambering around with the muscle memory of a seasoned killer. Simultaneously, we observe Donna Isabella in the East Wing. Notice her profound lack of panic. She methodically opens her husband's old writing desk and extracts a heavily worn Beretta pistol. She checks the action with the cool, practiced competence of someone who has survived decades of trauma. She does not scream, she prepares. This is the physiological difference between panic and experience. Panic makes people freeze and hope for a rescue. True experience teaches you that when the walls finally come crashing down, the only person coming to save you is yourself. The guard is hyperventilating, entirely consumed by the acute stress response. Donna Isabella, conversely, remains firmly anchored. She dismisses his frantic push for the cellar, calmly asserting that having survived the bloody Sicilian conflicts of 1967, she is not about to cower in a basement today. She orders him back to his post with absolute authority. Meanwhile, Lorenzo returns to the library, weapon drawn, ready to confront his captive. But the psychological landscape has completely fractured. The chair is empty. The heavy wooden door stands slightly ajar. It is a sobering reminder for all of us. Survival requires constant vigilance, because the moment you feel secure is precisely the moment you have been outsmarted. Let us examine the final psychological break. The unbroken lock proves an inside job. Lorenzo does not pause to process the betrayal. His limbic system shifts entirely into combat mode. He descends into a great hall that has become an active kill zone. Black-clad operators are breaching the perimeter. A loyalist is gunned down instantly. Lorenzo eliminates 2 threats with clinical, practiced violence. When a third attacker draws a theatrical blade, Lorenzo shoots him dead before the knife even clears the sheath. There is no hesitation, no cinematic posturing. Violence is terribly efficient. The hardest lesson of all is this. When betrayal finally shows its face, there is no time for questions. You must simply survive the answer. Let's examine this incident through the lens of behavioral survival. The second attacker hesitated, a fatal cognitive delay. Lorenzo eliminated him against the wainscoting, without a spike in his heart rate, dropping 4 targets in under 30 seconds. Upstairs, the auditory stimulus of the blast reached Elena. Her amygdala hijacked her system instantly. Growing up in the rough streets of Dorchester permanently wired her for threat detection. She dropped her towels, kept her body low, and intercepted little Sophia, whose face was drained of blood as she clutched a gray bear. Elena shoved the child under the heavy oak dining table, using her own body as a biological shield. In high-stress environments, we learn a simple truth. Trauma trains the body to protect itself long before the conscious mind processes the fear. Elena wrapped her arms around the small body, burying Sophia against her shoulder to block the visual trauma of the doorway. In terror states, auditory processing becomes hyperacute. She tracked heavy boots in the corridor, bracing for the worst. Then, a familiar vocal cue broke the tension. Vincent called out, asking Mrs. Bennet and Sophia to speak. Elena closed her eyes, her nervous system finally allowing one ragged breath. The old consigliere stepped through the doorway, with 5 armed enforcers clinically sweeping the room. He dropped to one knee, assessing the psychological state of mother and child in a fraction of a second. Displaying 0 emotional leakage, he simply ordered them to grab his coat. It is a vital life lesson. Safety is rarely a fortress. More often, it is simply the sudden, familiar sound of a trusted voice. Vincent guided them down the servant staircase and past the wine cellar, arriving at a door perfectly camouflaged within the stone masonry. This hidden threshold represents the architecture of criminal paranoia. He turned 2 keys, then pressed his hand to a biometric scanner. The heavy door slid open to reveal a sterile environment. This panic room was encased in poured concrete, a foot thick beneath a solid steel ceiling. It was stocked with survival rations, cots, and a sealed ventilation system. Surveillance monitors flickered with data from the estate. Vincent ushered the trembling mother and child into the vault. Studying these syndicates teaches us a simple, grounding lesson. The thicker the walls a person builds to keep the outside world away, the more deeply terrified they are of the consequences of their own actions. "You stay here," Vincent told them, instructing Alina to open the heavy steel door for absolutely no one but him, the boss, or Donna Isabella. She must wait for visual proof on the monitor, completely ignoring any familiar voice. Elena agreed, her voice remarkably flat. "In my clinical experience, women married to dangerous men develop a profound emotional bluntness to survive. Her marriage to Marcus Bennett had trained her nervous system to compartmentalize panic." Vincent stepped back, his hardened eyes softening as he looked at little Sophia. "You did a brave thing yesterday," he told her, "and today you must be brave again." The masked door began to swing shut. The simple lesson here is that true courage is not the absence of fear, but the choice to sit quietly in the dark. In the final sliver of light, Sophia pressed her cheek against her mother and whispered to the old enforcer. She told Mr. Vincent that she had seen the man with the scar earlier that day, spotting his car just before the loud noises started. The door sealed shut with a soft hiss of trapped air. Up above, the violence was shockingly brief. The shooting stopped at 12:12 in the afternoon, lasting exactly 1 minute. 60 seconds of automatic gunfire on a manicured lawn left 8 attackers dead on the grass. 3 of Lorenzo's men lay lifeless in the hall, with 2 others bleeding out. The north gate was destroyed, a wedding canopy pole blown across the drive. It is a sobering reminder that a lifetime of building security can be completely dismantled in 60 seconds. Smoke continued to rise from the explosive charge that had torn open the gates. Lorenzo walked the ground floor, his pistol still gripped tightly in his hand. He stepped over the dead with the clinical detachment of a man desensitized to humans' ruin. Finally reaching the basement security room, Vincent was already analyzing the camera feeds across 3 screens. He had frozen a specific frame from the corridor outside the library. At 11 minutes past 11, just seconds after the first blast, a figure moved past the servant stairs. The man turned his face away from the lens, demonstrating a chilling familiarity with the blind spots. We must always remember that the most dangerous threats in our lives rarely break through the front door. They usually know exactly where the cameras are. Stick with me here, because this is where the behavioral patterns expose the truth. The silver beard and the slight limp in the left knee were unmistakable markers of Tommy Castellano. He stopped at the library, pulling a key from his vest to unlock the door from the outside. He did not go in. 21 seconds later, Vivian Moretti walked out, completely unhurried and unharmed, slipping away toward the back stairs. Tommy locked the door behind her and walked in the opposite direction. Vincent stared at the screen, his voice heavy with exhaustion as he muttered that he knew it. When an empire is built on fear, loyalty is always a rental. The vital lesson we can learn from this is that betrayal never comes from your enemies. It always comes from the people holding your keys. Vincent noted that Tommy must have copied that key years ago, judging by how smoothly it turned in the lock. Lorenzo coldly ordered his men to track them both down. Tommy had escaped, grabbed his shirt, Tate's in a service van through the south doors, slipping past the burning front lodge. Lorenzo placed his weapon on the console and told them to wake his grandmother. But Donna Isabella was already awake. She had reloaded her pistol and was calmly pouring black coffee, acting as if it were 8 in the morning on a peaceful Sunday. Rather than the day death came to her home, she displayed the absolute emotional void of an apex predator. The lesson here is clear. True power does not scream or panic when everything falls apart. It simply makes a cup of coffee and calmly prepares to survive. She absorbed the news without a single interruption. When Vincent finished, she set her coffee down, stating their rival had been planning this psychological manipulation for years. She knew Tommy could not have compromised a fortress of this size alone. Vincent suggested they look at the banks, and she agreed. She ordered a clinical dissection of every senior soldier and offshore account, demanding a report on irregular wire transfers from Sicily or the Caymans by sundown. Her terrifying authority ensured Vincent's people delivered the records by 6 that evening. The deepest lesson we find in these cases is that criminals always leave a trail. You can mask your emotions and hide your face, but human greed will always expose its true nature on a simple financial ledger. Stick with me here, because behavioral patterns always expose the truth. 2 names emerged from the records. Bobby Ferraro had taken 4 wires of $20,000 over 18 months via Lugano. Salato showed transfers from a Maltese front that Vincent recognized as a laundering operation for Salvatore Heir. Lorenzo processed the betrayal instantly, ordering the men brought in alive for interrogation, while Vincent issued quiet commands in Italian over an untraceable basement phone. A profound psychological defense mechanism was activating 2 floors below. Inside that windowless concrete vault, little Sophia was quietly drawing. The life lesson here is stark but beautiful. While adults scheme and destroy each other for control, a child will instinctively rely on pure creativity to process the unimaginable chaos of their reality. Elena located a yellow legal pad and a half-dozen old crayons on a shelf. Displaying extreme compliance, Sophia politely asked permission to use them. She focused for an hour, engaging in spontaneous art therapy to organize her fragmented trauma. When Vincent returned at 6 o'clock, the child stood unprompted and handed him the paper. Vincent studied the artifact, then carried it upstairs in silence. He placed the sketch on Lorenzo's desk under the green lamp. It was a crude but chilling portrait of an older man in a dark coat. A single, deliberate line of red crayon slashed down his left cheek, resembling dried blood. We can learn a profound lesson from this moment. The subconscious mind never truly forgets the face of a monster, and a child's unfiltered expression is often the most accurate witness of all. The drawing lacked technical skill, yet its clinical accuracy was undeniable. Vincent instantly matched the facial structure to his internal threat database. He had seen this exact pathology in a 2009 surveillance photo from Catania and a 2022 image from Marseille. Now, the megalomaniacal narcissist stared back at him from yellow paper, captured perfectly by a child's traumatic recall. Vincent quietly identified the man as Salvatore Heir. Lorenzo held the paper under the light, realizing Sophia had just handed them their target. By 8 o'clock, the perimeter was heavily reinforced with psychologically vetted loyalists. The underlying lesson of this case file is deeply moving. The answers to our most dangerous problems often come from the most vulnerable among us, if we simply pay attention. Let's look at this piece by piece, shall we? Lorenzo displays classic territorial lockdown. He moves the subjects to the blue bedroom in the east wing, securing the perimeter with 2 veteran enforcers. They remain stationed there for 72 hours straight. Then, we observe a radical behavioral shift. Lorenzo, a man ruled by control, clears his entire day for a child. He prepares a structured environment in the morning room. Toast points, scrambled eggs, sliced peaches, cold milk. This is not just breakfast. It is a calculated psychological baseline. He places a leather portfolio on the low table and simply waits. Sophia finally enters, anchoring herself to her mother's hand for physical security. The visual contrast here is deeply fascinating. Sophia arrives wearing a soft yellow dress, a color entirely foreign to the sterile, trauma-inducing environment of a panic room. Her hair is neatly braided, and she clutches a gray bear, a classic transitional object for anxiety management. Lorenzo greets her softly. He employs textbook cognitive interviewing techniques suitable for pediatric trauma victims. He removes the pressure of a forced memory, telling her there are no wrong answers. He asks her to look at photographs and simply state if she recognizes anyone. It is a masterful, low-stress prompt. Sophia gives a grave nod, climbing into the heavy armchair, while instinctively tucking her bear close to her chest for comfort. Slowly, Lorenzo opens the portfolio to begin the assessment. Inside the portfolio sits a curated visual lineup. 43 images sourced from European intelligence, port surveillance, and customs databases. It is a complete sociogram of the syndicate's upper hierarchy. Lorenzo turns the images one by one, establishing a steady rhythm. For the first 11, Sophia's response is a consistent, gentle denial. But on the 12th image, her baseline shifts. She pauses. The photo shows a lean man with pale eyes in a charcoal suit, captured outside a Naples cafe. Her recall is immediate and specific. She quietly notes that this man visited her home twice, drank coffee with her father, and notably, displayed a flat affect he never smiled. Children are highly sensitive to adult micro-expressions. Lorenzo calmly sets the photograph aside without a word. Her pattern recognition remains flawless. On the 19th image, she flags a heavy-set man, linking him to an auditory memory of aggression he once shouted at her father in the hallway. Then comes the 27th photograph, a younger male with dark hair. Sophia's associative memory opens up entirely. She reports this subject was a frequent visitor, linking him to a woman and a man with a scar. She notes a defensive behavioral quirk. He never removed his coat indoors. She adds that her mother exhibited a strong aversion to him, absorbing the ambient household tension. Lorenzo processes this intelligence without breaking eye contact with the images. He simply calls out to his enforcer, Vincent, who steps silently out from the doorway. Lorenzo taps the photograph. Vincent leans in, and while his face remains stoic, his autonomic nervous system betrays him his breathing hitches slightly. He identifies the man as Lorenzo Bianchi, the right hand to the megalomaniac narcissist running the rival faction. The logic is swift. If Bianchi was operating in Boston years ago, he is here now. The order to hunt him is given. Beside them, Sophia completely compartmentalizes the interaction. Having just dismantled a criminal cell's operational security in 7 minutes, she calmly eats a peach slice. Her nervous system has completely normalized the abnormal. Lorenzo studies her profound resilience for a long second. Then, gently smooths back a stray piece of hair that had escaped her braid. You and I have probably both seen how humans handle sudden displacement. Downstairs in the kitchen, Elena exhibits a textbook coping mechanism. The head cook finds her pressing both hands flat against the butcher block, a physical grounding technique to anchor herself to reality. Elena demands to be put to work, noting the 40 armed guards who need 3 meals a day. She is trying to earn her safety through utility, a survival strategy deeply ingrained in those who have endured long-term psychological captivity. The cook studies her for a moment, then simply hands her an apron and points toward the heavy iron stove. By noon, she is fully immersed in the task, using physical labor to drown out the echoes of her recent trauma. This is how Donna Isabella finds her. Elena stands there with rolled sleeves, browning massive trays of meat for the perimeter guards. Donna Isabella observes this desperate need for purpose for a full minute before approaching. What happens next is a profound psychological transference of status. The matriarch removes a gold medallion of St. Anne, a symbol of maternal protection she has worn for 50 years, and places it on the wood. She validates Elena's worth entirely through the resilience of her child, declaring that raising such a daughter demands absolute respect in this territory. Elena says emotional floodgates strain, yet she suppresses the tears. In traumatic environments, showing vulnerability is dangerous. She wipes her hands, accepting the heavy medallion, quietly locking the symbol of safety within her palms. Upstairs, a breakthrough occurs. Sophia laughs. It is a dry, rusty sound, the vocal cords unaccustomed to expressing joy after severe environmental stress. It is her first genuine positive affect since the wedding violence began. Lorenzo freezes, analytically registering the emotional milestone, before slowly resuming his task. The clinical quiet of the day shatters at 7 that evening when his phone vibrates. 3 words arrive from Vincent. They have Bianche. The setting shifts to a Brooklyn warehouse, a structure owned by the family since 1968. Visually, it is designed for psychological invisibility. Under a single harsh bulb, 2 operatives lean against the cold masonry, smoking, their hands hovering near their concealed weapons. Stick with me, this is where the interrogation strategy gets truly interesting. The captive, Bianchi, is sitting under a single hanging work light. Notice what is missing here. Physical restraints, bruising, blood. His hands are free. He has an untouched coffee. He even still has his shoelaces. This absence of physical violence is a highly sophisticated form of mental pressure. Physical pain gives a subject something to resist. Depriving them of it leaves them drowning in anticipatory dread. Bianchi looks up, and his affect is not terror, but profound, soul-deep exhaustion, the hallmark of chronic hypervigilance. Lorenzo drags a chair across the raw concrete, invading his personal space until their knees touch, establishing total physical dominance in the room. Vincent remains standing just outside the harsh cone of light, acting as a looming, shadowy stressor. Lorenzo's vocal tone is deliberately quiet, stripping away the aggression Bianca expects. He explicitly states they will not use physical torture, dismissing it as the slow way. He is dismantling the captive's mental preparations. Then, Lorenzo targets Bianca's core survival instinct by invoking the pathology of Salvatore Vieri. Vieri is a megalomaniac narcissist who consults his own inner circle to maintain absolute power. Lorenzo clinically lists the data points. Vieri has buried his last 3 lieutenants in Sicily, Malta, and Lisbon. By presenting this undeniable behavioral pattern, Lorenzo forces Bianchi to confront his own inevitable expiration date. Lorenzo tightens the psychological vice, pointing out that Bianchi personally helped bury 2 of his predecessors. The cognitive dissonance shatters. Bianchi's jaw tightens as he processes the inescapable reality of his employer's psychopathy. Lorenzo then applies a classic time-limited contingency. Provide the operational intel, and you walk away alive. The boundary is physical, the offer that expires the moment Lorenzo stands up. The silence hangs heavy for 8 seconds, a massive internal calculation. And then Bianchi breaks. There are no dramatic tears, no moral epiphanies. It is the cold capitulation of a man prioritizing his own biological survival over his loyalties. He confesses that the narcissist is already here. Vieri arrived 6 days ago and is hiding at the plaza. Bianchi meticulously unloads the spatial layout. Penthouse 3. Guards in service uniforms at the door and down the hall. Vieri's narcissistic obsession demanded he be physically present to claim the ultimate prize, the Duca family seat, an object of his fixation for 9 years. Lorenzo demands the full timeline. Bianchi swallows hard, his fight-or-flight response completely deactivated. He explains the original machination, a sociopathic infiltration via the wedding. Vivian was meant to marry Lorenzo, and within 60 days, Lorenzo would suffer a chemically induced, fatal cardiac event in his sleep. No messy shootouts, just a quiet assassination. Vivian would then inherit the legitimate corporate structures, supported by a network of capos who had already been secretly compromised. The parasitic strategy was elegant in its design. Vivian would be cemented as the head, and Vieri would soon arrive as her strategic partner, swallowing the organization whole. Lorenzo processes this betrayal without a single facial tick. He simply asks what disrupted their timeline. Bianchi drops his gaze, admitting the critical variable. Sophia, the child's existence, was a massive blind spot in their intelligence. To adapt, Vieri launched the violent assault as a stress test on the perimeter, sacrificing pawns to identify loyalists and extract his assets. It was a classic narcissistic pivot, reframing a failed assassination as a tactical victory. Now Vieri is actively manipulating reality, spreading disinformation that Lorenzo is dead and his entire empire is rapidly crumbling. We are about to uncover what really went down in the climax of this psychological warfare. Bianchi reveals that the compromised capos have been summoned to a clandestine gathering at the Duca Mausoleum in Greenwood Cemetery. There, Vivian will play the grieving widow, and the megalomaniac, Heir, will arrive in person to consolidate his newly stolen empire. Vincent stands paralyzed by the sheer audacity of the scheme. Lorenzo processes the data, sitting utterly motionless. Slowly, a micro-expression fractures his stoic facade. The corner of his mouth lifts, but it lacks any warmth or humor. It is the chilling, predatory grimace of a sociopath who has just been handed the perfect trap. The wolf is done pretending to graze. With terrifying quietness, Lorenzo simply whispers, "Well then, we will give them a funeral," Lorenzo announced, rising. He gave a deliberate nod to his guards, who understood instantly and halted their advance on Bianchi. A megalomaniac narcissist often thrives on grand, theatrical displays of mercy, so the offer was honored. Bianchi was on a flight out of Newark before midnight. Stepping into the biting Brooklyn cold, Lorenzo gave his order. "Bring them all in. Every capo I can still trust." 2 hours. The black sedan vanished toward Long Island. By 11, the study was packed with dangerous men. Lorenzo took the seat of absolute power at his father's desk, illuminated only by the green lamp. A map of Greenwood Cemetery lay open before him like a surgeon's chart. Sometimes, true survival requires us to become the very monsters we fear. Let us examine the psychological chessboard in this room together. Vincent stood to Lorenzo's right, a black coffee in hand, a grounding mechanism for adrenaline. Donna Isabella sat in the wing-backed chair to his left, her ankles crossed, a worn beretta resting in her lap, as if it were an extension of her own nervous system. 6 senior capos formed a loose half-circle, a classic primate display of submission to the alpha. Lorenzo skipped the preamble. "As of an hour ago," he announced, "Salvatore Heir believes I am dead. He believes my grandmother is sealed in a cellar and Vincent is running on pure trauma response. The megalomaniac narcissist has called a meeting tomorrow night at the Greenwood Mausoleum. Our mausoleum. A megalomaniac narcissist like Heir cannot simply kill. He must entirely consume. He intends to seat Vivian Moretti as the grieving widow, mentally subjugating the territories he already bought, and casually walk out of Brooklyn as the puppeteer of the Duca family." Lorenzo let that psychological weight settle over the room for one heavy beat. "He is going to walk into our family ground," Lorenzo stated, "and find us waiting." He tapped the map. "Tomorrow at sunset, a hearse leaves this estate, a closed casket. Lorenzo Duca, officially murdered by an unknown assailant. It will be observed, photographed, and reported, feeding Heir's confirmation bias. Stefano, Carmine, and 4 highly visible men will accompany the body." Lorenzo was effectively directing a behavioral theater of grief. His men were to dress for a funeral, mimicking the exact body language of soldiers whose alpha has been violently removed. They needed to project confusion and anger, signaling to Heir that they were easy to dominate. Stefano nodded, internalizing the role. "The mausoleum gathering is set for 9, Lorenzo continued. Heir will arrive early, needing to establish territorial dominance. Tommy and Vivian will accompany him. The corrupted capos, Ferraro and Imperato, will arrive expecting to form a new psychological quorum." Lorenzo's finger traced the map. 3 buildings border the cemetery on the east. The maintenance shed, the chapel, the bell tower. Each structure offered a perfectly unobstructed sightline to the Duca plot. "By 8 tomorrow night, I will have shooters in all 3, Lorenzo stated with flat affect. "Vincent already has the names. Each team carries thermal optics and long guns, and no one fires until I initiate the sequence." Carmine asked quietly what Lorenzo's role would be. "I will be inside the casket," he replied. "I will emerge when the psychological shock value is absolute." A dry sound rippled through the room, a trauma response masquerading as a chuckle. Vincent set down his coffee. "And Vivian," he asked, "what is the protocol for her? She chose her pathology," Lorenzo said without looking up. Donna Isabella closed her eyes for one singular second. When Donna Isabella opened her eyes, the pupil dilation had completely reset. Total emotional detachment. "It must end cleanly," she diagnosed. "There is no cognitive space for mercy toward a woman who weaponized her wedding gown just to put my grandson in the dirt. Finish it all tomorrow night." The men verbally reinforced the plan 3 times, building procedural memory until it was entirely reflexive. Go, the matriarch commanded. Sleep if your neurochemistry allows it. They dispersed, but Lorenzo's hypervigilance kept him awake. At nearly 2 a.m, his adrenaline still surging, he climbed the back stairs. He knocked very softly on the door of the below bedroom in the east wing. Elena answered in her dressing gown. You and I have probably both noticed how trauma shapes a person's baseline expectations. Elena did not look surprised to see him. She simply let him in. 7-year-old Sophia was fully awake, propped against her pillows holding a stuffed bear, operating on that primal instinct children develop when they subconsciously read the environmental cues of adult terror. Lorenzo sat on the edge of the mattress, suppressing his own imposing physical presence. He pressed a brass key into Elena's palm. This belongs to an apartment on East 64th, he explained, his tone measured and hypnotic. The doorman knows your assumed name. The space is fully provisioned. Cash and clean documents are secured. If tomorrow fails, Vincent will evacuate you. You stay until I retrieve you, Lorenzo instructed, locking eyes with her to ensure cognitive retention. If I do not survive, the property is yours. Elena's hand closed tightly around the brass key, a tactile anchor in a moment of sheer panic. When she looked up, her tear ducts were already overflowing. Why are you doing this for us? She whispered, her self-worth completely fractured. We are nobody, just the cook and her child. Lorenzo paused, observing the small girl on the bed. He looked at the gray bear and the hyper-vigilant eyes of a child who had recently faced down 32 armed predators, without flinching. Because your daughter, he said, his voice stripped of all psychological defenses, provided the one thing my environment lacks. She gave me reality when every sycophant in this organization offered only calculated illusions. Elena pressed the metal key to her mouth, completely nonverbal from the emotional overload. Sophia simply extended both arms. Lorenzo bent down, allowing her to wrap her fragile limbs around his neck. The gray bear pressed into his shoulder, a startling contrast of innocence against a lethal apex predator. Be careful, Mr. Renzo, the child whispered into his ear. The man with the scar is severely antisocial. I will be careful, he promised, placing a grounding kiss on her head. He exited with deliberate calm. Down in the study, the Glock rested on the desk. He gripped it, his muscle memory, recognizing the tool of his violent trade. His fingers locked around the polymer grip, his prefrontal cortex fully committed to the violent resolution ahead. It was time to terminate the pathology. Greenwood Cemetery at 9 o'clock was a sprawling, necrotic expanse, a literal country of stones. The fog, rolling off the harbor, functioned as a sensory deprivation chamber, drifting between the tilted crosses and isolating the heavy mausoleums. 200,000 dead lay in the cold earth. The Duca tomb stood at the end of Cypress Avenue, a pale stone monument of ancestral narcissism, sealed for 11 years. Tonight, the iron door was cracked open. A black mahogany casket rested on 2 trestle stands directly in front of the psychological trap, its brass handles gleaming in the mist. A single white wreath laid across the lid, a textbook symbol of mourning engineered to deceive. 6 of Lorenzo's operatives stood in rigid attention, heads bowed, shoulders slumped, to simulate the profound neurobiological crash of grief. Stefano Brun held his position at the foot of the casket, his facial muscles projecting the hollow devastation of a subordinate who has just lost his structural universe. Clinically speaking, it was a masterful performance. The first targets arrived at exactly 3 minutes to 9. Tommy Castellano stepped from a black town car, his body language oozing unearned dopamine. He swaggered up the path with the relaxed gait of a man who believes he has conquered the hierarchy. He completely ignored Stefano. Tommy offered the casket a single, dismissive nod, treating the deceased alpha like a displaced piece of furniture. A pure display of psychopathic objectification. Bobby Ferraro and Sal Imperato emerged next, their expressions carefully masked. Joey DeMo and Veto Lanza followed, completing the cluster of 6 defectors. They maintained a polite nervous distance from the mahogany box. At exactly 9, the apex of this delusion arrived. Vivian stepped out first, trading her typical cashmere for stark, dramatic black. Long coat, severe updo, and noticeably devoid of a mourning veil. The narcissistic widow she was playing simply could not resist showing her face. She walked up the path with a micro-expression of absolute duper's delight. Now, let us look at the megalomaniac himself. Salvatore Vieri emerged exactly as the traumatized child had mapped him in her drawings. Tall, dark hair, graying at the temples, draped in an oversized charcoal coat. The surgical scar, slicing down his left cheek, was fully illuminated by the ambient fog, a visible manifestation of his violent history. He walked without the slightest spike in cortisol. He stopped near the casket, placing an ungloved hand on the polished wood with inappropriate intimacy. "Well," Vieri murmured in fluid Italian, relishing the sound of his own dominance, "here we are." Castellano gave a submissive nod. Ferraro lit a cigarette to manage his nerves, while Vivian gravitated to the new alpha, cementing her Stockholm shift. "The Duca seat passes tonight," Vieri announced to his newly acquired sycophants, his ego inflating to fill the graveyard. "You will accept her as the widow, and you will accept me as her controller." He was laying down the new cognitive framework. Anyone who finds this objectionable should speak now. Total silence followed the ultimate behavioral submission. "Excellent," he purred. Vivian's narcissistic smile broke containment. "I will inherit as the widow," she declared, drunk on perceived power. "The loyalists will be broken, the old woman silenced, and Russo retired." Vieri chuckled, a dark, sociopathic sound. "Russo will be permanently retired," he corrected. "But that is mere housekeeping." And then, high in the bell tower, a firing pin clicked. 3 sets of stadium lamps ignited simultaneously. Cypress Avenue, the casket, the capos, the bride, and Salvatore Vieri were instantly drenched in a flat, clinical white light. From a behavioral standpoint, stripping away the shadow shatters a criminal's cognitive defense mechanisms. Vieri pulled his hand back as the casket lid opened. Lorenzo Duca emerged in a charcoal suit, a weapon already steady in his grip. He stepped onto the cold gravel with the terrifying calm of a man utterly detached from fear. Vivian's constant smile dissolved among the tombstones. 30 of Vincent's men closed in, forming a slow, suffocating ring of raised rifles. When you drag a person's deepest deceptions into the blinding light of day, their manufactured reality will always break. The bell tower glittered with 3 concealed rifles, while the chapel roof held 2 more. Notice with me how perfectly this trap mirrors a psychological enclosure. Vincent stepped out from the mausoleum, a short carbine resting naturally in his weathered hands. Lorenzo spoke, his voice unnervingly flat as it carried through the thick fog. "You came to my family ground. That was your last mistake." The narcissistic mind perpetually believes it is untouchable, prompting Vieri to reach into his coat. Instantly, the cemetery erupted into violence. The first burst of gunfire rained down from the bell tower, dropping 2 men before their brains could even register the threat. Stefano fired a single round through Bobby's chest. Arrogance always blinds us to the traps laid right at our feet. Salato's flight response activated instantly. He turned to bolt, but met a heavy shotgun blast from the chapel wall. Joey threw up his hands, screaming words lost to the chaos, a textbook manifestation of panic. Tommy reached for his weapon. His motor reflexes were sharp, but outmatched by Vincent's conditioned lethality. Vincent's carbine fired twice, burying 2 rounds into Tommy's sternum. He folded backward, over the casket stand, and lay completely motionless. The psychological shock of the ambush finally broke the remaining capos, forcing them to their knees on the sharp gravel. Amidst the thick smoke, Vivian tapped into her deep survival instincts, darting between the ancient headstones in her dark coat. True character is always exposed in the frantic seconds when everything falls apart. Vieri drew an old chrome pistol, firing as his self-preservation instinct overrode all logic. One of Vincent's soldiers collapsed behind a granite cross, his shoulder shattered. The squad returned fire, but Vieri kept low and fast, a predator backed into a corner. His coat flaring in the harsh light, he hit a dead sprint around the mausoleum, desperate to break the perimeter. But Lorenzo had anticipated this exact behavioral loop. He had circled wide the very second the lamps ignited. Lorenzo stepped around the back of the structure, precisely as his target arrived. The two men nearly collided in the claustrophobic gap between the icy marble wall and the rusted iron railing. Vieri froze. Lorenzo froze. A cornered mind believes it can outrun consequence until it hits an immovable wall. Gunfire raged behind them on the avenue. From the bell tower, a rifle cracked twice, punctuating the chaos. Between Lorenzo and the megalomaniac lay exactly 5 meters of dead November grass. Both stood with weapons raised, staring directly into each other, eyes for the first time after 9 years of pathological hunting. Gradually, the distant violence thinned out. The last of the loyalists had either surrendered or bled out on the stones. The cemetery sank into that unnatural, ringing quiet that follows massive trauma, a neurological shock where the ear simply refuses to process the horror it just endured. In the freezing, narrow stone corridor behind the family tomb, neither man moved a muscle. Finding true closure often requires us to stare our oldest demons directly in the face. Notice this critical moment of psychological standoff with me. Both weapons remained perfectly level. The freezing fog curled around their knees, clinging to the marble tomb. Then, Vieri smiled. This was not the smile of someone expecting survival. It was a symptom of extreme grandiosity, the smirk of a narcissist who had outlived governments and rival syndicates. He had convinced himself he was immortal. "You think killing me ends this?" he asked, his tone dripping with dark amusement. He claimed a successor in Naples would awaken to inherit his bloody empire, and then another. He boasted the Duca bloodline was etched onto an execution list that would easily outlive him. A truly toxic legacy operates like a vicious virus, always outlasting the very host that unleashed it into the world. "Maybe," Lorenzo replied, utterly detached. "But not you." Vieri's cold eyes scanned his opponent's face, searching for a micro-expression of weakness. When he found what he thought was a fracture, he probed the wound. "I met your father once in 1998, he murmured. He praised the dead man's caution, mocking how natural causes had ruined his own sadistic plans for murder. Lorenzo absorbed the psychological blow without blinking. Pressing further, Vieri pivoted to Marcus Bennett, speaking as casually as if they were standing in a quiet library instead of a graveyard. He knew the child had witnessed the trauma, knew the fragile mind was scarred. Toxic predators always weaponize our deepest grief to maintain control. Yet absolute silence remains our greatest shield. He cried like a baby, Vieri stated, dissecting the memory with sheer cruelty. On Route 17, he wept for his wife, Grehes Daughterfor, and the money I stole. The narcissist fed on that absolute subjugation, relishing how Marcus died begging and apologizing. To Vieri, raw human vulnerability was just pathetic. "They are all weak in the end," he sneered. Lorenzo's jaw tightened, the only leak of his repressed fury. "He had a daughter," Lorenzo countered, "who is braver in 7 years than you have been in 60. A malignant ego cannot tolerate such an insult." Vieri's smile turned razor. Then as he confessed his one regret, he should have executed the little girl 4 years ago. The darkest minds never feel genuine guilt for their sins, only frustration for their incomplete work. Vieri recalled debating whether to kill the child, noting Vivienne had found the idea unnecessary. "I should have insisted?" He shrugged. That was the final psychological trigger. Lorenzo's weapon barked a single shot. The round shattered Vieri's right shoulder, a calculated strike to destroy the motor function of his gun arm. The pistol slipped from his numb fingers, clattering against the marble. The kingpin staggered backward into the iron railing and collapsed to one knee. As Lorenzo advanced, tunnel vision blinded him to his surroundings. Vivienne had not fled. Driven by a deep parasitic loyalty, she had stalked silently through the fog, raising a small black pistol directly at his spine. Extreme focus is a powerful asset, but it creates our deadliest blind spots. She stood merely 8 feet from his spine, her nervous system perfectly regulated for the kill. But Vivienne never pulled the trigger. A dry, unimpressive crack snapped from the opposite corner of the mausoleum. It was the distinct sound of a small-caliber weapon, fired with absolute emotional detachment at close range. Vivienne's body jolted. Her pistol tumbled into the dead grass. The loyal operative folded forward at the waist, collapsing without a single vocalization, her dark coat spilling over the wet earth like an expanding shadow. Donna Isabella Duca calmly lowered her vintage Beretta. She materialized from the freezing fog in a heavy coat, her ancient face an unreadable mask. We often look for threats in the obvious places, forgetting that quiet resilience hides the most terrifying strength. A faint wisp of smoke drifted from the Beretta. Isabella's expression was completely flat, demonstrating the blunted effect typical of lifelong trauma survivors. She clinically evaluated the dead woman, shifted her gaze to her grandson, and finally studied the kneeling narcissist. "I told you, Lorenzo," she murmured. "I survived Sicily in 1967. Despite the agonizing pain, Heir began to laugh. It was a wet, fractured sound as blood soaked his coat. His grandiosity demanded he control his final narrative. "Old woman," he wheezed, praising her ruthless nature. The jagged scar on his face glowed blue under the harsh lights. He stared up at Lorenzo, demanding his own execution. "Finish it," he spat. A massive ego will always choose a violent end over the total humiliation of living in defeat. "No," Lorenzo answered. "You and I must recognize the power shift here." Denying a narcissist his requested ending shatters his constructed reality. Lorenzo dissected 40 years of the man's pathology out loud, burying rivals, burying Marcus Bennett, hunting a 7-year-old child to erase his own mistakes. "A bullet would be the easy ending," Lorenzo stated, devoid of empathy. "You do not get the easy ending." With clinical precision, he dialed a single number. "Agent Howran," he spoke evenly. "It is time. Greenwood Cemetery. I have the gift we discussed. He is alive, needs a doctor, and requires a massive indictment." He paused, absorbing the weight of absolute victory. "Yes, all of it. True justice is never about simple revenge. It is about completely dismantling the abuser's power." As agreed, the call ended, but Heir's gaze held the chilling stillness of a true megalomaniac narcissist. "Let's look at this piece by piece, shall we?" Down the avenue, blue police lights pierced the fog. 48 hours after the cemetery, the world reorganized itself. Helicopter photos dominated the morning papers. The European ghost they chased across 3 continents for 19 years was caught at a Brooklyn mausoleum. Armed escorts rushed him to a Manhattan facility for a shoulder wound, then straight to arraignment on 412 counts. Naples, Marseille, and Miami filed doomed extradition requests. The press whispered in the careful tones of absolute fear. In the end, no matter how untouchable a malignant mind believes itself to be, reality always collects its debt. Let us open the case file on the trial of the century. It offers a textbook conclusion to organized antisocial behavior. Tommy Castellano, Bobby Ferraro, and Celine Parado were deceased. The remaining enforcers were processed with plea agreements, facing lives behind bars. But the true pathology lies with the woman in the morgue. Born Victoria Esposito in 1995, she was groomed by Salvatore Heir. He pulled her from a convent at 16, spending 9 years erasing her identity to create the phantom Vivienne Moretti. This was not mere fraud. This was the ultimate psychological manipulation of a megalomaniac narcissist, playing God with human cognition. When a predator writes your reality, you cease to exist. Lorenzo reviewed the dossier, placing it on the desk with clinical detachment. By the 3rd morning, he summoned Donna Isabella. She arrived at 10, wrapped in gray cashmere, her physical markers of chronic stress fractionally diminished. She had finally slept. She sat with the flattened affect of a seasoned matriarch, while Vincent stood paralyzed by the window. Then, Lorenzo initiated a profound cognitive rupture. "Grandmother," he said quietly, "I want to leave this world." Isabella exhibited zero autonomic arousal. Not a single blink. I have been waiting for this morning since you were 8 years old, she replied evenly. Tell me what you mean by it. We often inherit psychological cages, but occasionally, a subject chooses to finally dismantle the bars. Examine this behavioral pivot with me. Lorenzo laid out his plans, initiating a total systemic purge. 70% of their operations, he explained, would transition to legitimate corporate entities within 12 months. The Manhattan, hotels, the upstate trucking, the restaurant groups all sanitized by accountants, ready for state scrutiny. The malignant 30% would be surgically excised. Protection rackets, gambling rings, and smuggled cigarette routes were scheduled termination. Donna Isabella observed this shift in total silence. What I keep, Lorenzo concluded, is the part of this family that never required concealment. He was systematically cutting away a generational tumor, hoping the healthy tissue could still survive on its own. The Mulberry Street Bakery, the Atlantic City vending routes, these honest behavioral anchors would remain. Hearing this, Vincent finally turned from the glass. He displayed a micro-expression of approval, a faint smile typical of an enforcer analyzing a tactical shift. The lieutenants are not going to process this, well, Vincent noted, predicting the inevitable narcissistic injury of the old guard. Lorenzo's response demonstrated remarkable emotional regulation. They maintain their autonomy, he stated. Anyone wishing to retain their criminal identity may take their crew and defect to rival factions. They leave with 0 debts and 0 obligations, departing in absolute peace. He was neutralizing their conditioned aggression by removing the psychological trigger of perceived entrapment. As for those who remain, Lorenzo proposed a radical cognitive intervention. They would become legitimate businessmen, with subsidized education if necessary. Donna Isabella released a soft laugh, a rare breach of her usual effective blunting. For the first time in 3 days, you have your grandfather's mouth, she observed, placing one heavily ringed hand on his shoulder. Your parents would be profoundly proud of you today. Overwhelmed by this sudden influx of positive emotional reinforcement, Lorenzo lost his vocal regulation. He simply covered her hand with his own. Once she withdrew and left him to his solitude, he remained fixed at the window. The environmental stimuli had shifted entirely. The morning felt stripped of its usual paranoia, offering a clean, unburdened mental state. Let us analyze the physical environment. By 9 o'clock, the fog dissipated, revealing oaks turning their brief November bronze. Down at the perimeter, a new employee walked the fence with a clipboard, focusing on maintenance rather than fortification. For the first time in his adult development, Lorenzo surveyed his territory, without the crushing somatic weight of a predator guarding a kill. The hypervigilance was gone. In its place was a neurological baseline he barely recognized: peace. When spring emerged 6 months later, the estate's psychological profile had transformed. The gatekeeper's shed grabbed his shirt, the gatekeepers threatening khaki uniforms. They carried clipboards instead of lethal sidearms, signaling a complete cessation of the generational wartime mentality. The architecture of trauma was systematically dismantled. The north gate's imposing ironwork was replaced and softened with budding climbing roses. In the south garden, oppressive canopies were swapped for a weathered cedar pergola, sheltering ordinary wicker chairs designed for healthy familial bonding. The paranoia that once dictated their lives evaporated. Nobody carried a concealed weapon. The hidden ballistics cabinets were emptied. Even the subterranean panic room, the ultimate symbol of existential dread, was decommissioned and repurposed for wine storage. They maintained 8 perimeter guards, but only as a standard precaution for a property of that scale. The environment was no longer a fortress designed to repel hostile forces. It was finally a habitat designed to nurture human life. You see, the security personnel now reported to a licensed firm, severing the toxic loyalty to a syndicate boss. For the first time in 70 years, the residence ceased functioning as a vault for dark secrets. In this newly sanitized reality, Elena Bennett was presented with a corporate elevation, head of hospitality for the Park Avenue Hotel, complete with a six-figure salary and a vehicle. She processed the data, folded the document, and established an unbreakable personal boundary. "Mr. Duca," she stated firmly, "I am a cook, and I wish to remain one." But she demanded healthy terms, her own designated living space, and compensation reflecting her actual value. She was rejecting the trauma bond entirely, demanding to exist not as a dependent captive, but as a fully autonomous individual. Lorenzo exhibited a genuine vocalized laugh, a sound entirely absent for a week. By that afternoon, he reinforced her autonomy with a new contract. Elena and Sophia were granted a carriage house on the grounds, featuring a custom kitchen and a secluded garden where the child could ride a bicycle, free from the pervasive gaze of syndicate watchmen. Sophia, now 8 years old, was transitioning into normative childhood development. She enrolled at St. Margaret's, wearing a standard navy jumper and carrying a leather satchel that Donna Isabella insisted on, selecting a fascinating grandmotherly proxy behavior. Her tuition was funded by a charitable foundation Lorenzo established in her late father's name. They were actively rewriting the girl's neurobiology through secure, predictable environments. Sophia remained unaware of the financial mechanics, and Elena ceased her defensive resistance. We observe a rapid remission of post-traumatic stress markers here. By Christmas, the nocturnal terrors vanished. By February, Sophia displayed uninhibited joy at the dinner table, and by April she possessed the cognitive confidence to correct Lorenzo's Italian. During their evening chess matches, Lorenzo modeled extreme patience, teaching her the calculated restraint of the queen. Observing, from the periphery, Elena experienced an emotional state she struggled to categorize. Through a complex dynamic that morphed into genuine attachment, Sophia had acquired the stable male figure her biological father failed to be. Meanwhile, Vincent successfully integrated into civilian life, managing clean restaurants. Operating venues across Manhattan and Queens, Vincent engaged in normative complaints about menus and vintages, displaying the highest baseline happiness of his life. The most striking shift came from Donna Isabella. After 9 years of weaponizing social gatherings for syndicate operations, she hosted a dinner devoid of ulterior motives. The formal table accommodated 6 subjects: Isabella, Lorenzo, Vincent with his spouse, and Elena with Sophia. They introduced positive sensory anchors, fresh flowers, lit candles, and an old Caruso vinyl playing nearby. Isabella had consciously decided to condition the environment for aesthetic pleasure rather than tactical advantage. As the meal concluded, Lorenzo stood up, raising his glass to address his completely reconstructed psychological support system. He offered a toast to family, factual reality, and the juvenile subject whose interventions preserved their collective sanity. Sophia, accompanied by her transitional object, a gray bear, exhibited a luminescent, congruent smile. Crystal touched. The operatic stimulus continued. Down the corridor, a neglected mechanical clock resumed ticking, symbolizing the restart of normal temporal processing. The estate had successfully transitioned from a syndicate stronghold into a functional domestic space. As we close this file, we see the narrative resolve not with ballistic trauma, but with illumination. Not a mortuary ritual, but communal nourishment. A vulnerable child was finally granted the fundamental human requirements of physical safety, intrinsic dignity, and a thoroughly validated voice. Let us review our final clinical takeaway, a psychological axiom I urged you to internalize. The most courageous verbalization in a crisis rarely originates from the dominant alpha, nor the heavily resourced, nor the individual society is conditioned to blindly follow. Occasionally, it emerges from the most statistically insignificant subject in the room, a minor in borrowed clothing, gripping a fragmented photograph. A single, unfiltered transmission of truth, delivered at the critical threshold, possesses the power to interrupt a catastrophic generational cycle. Therefore, audit your own environments, process the data provided by your dependents, observe the invisible labor force, validate those who lack the power to manipulate you, because they are often the only ones offering an uncorrupted view of reality. We spend our lives analyzing the dark fractures of the human mind, but you and I know that the most profound psychological truths often come from the quietest places. If this clinical breakdown of power and vulnerability resonated with you, please like this video, share it, and subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into the human psyche. Has a soft voice ever cut through the noise to tell you a truth you desperately needed to hear? Tell me your story in the comments. The simplest life lesson we can draw here is to listen to the innocent. Their intuition is rarely clouded by ego. I read every comment. May your mind remain sharp, your empathy intact, and your own life free from the shadows we study here. Stay safe and take care of each other.
One of the most powerful lessons from Sophia Bennett's story is that truth does not always come from the loudest, richest, or most powerful person in the room. Sometimes it comes from the smallest voice, the one everyone is most tempted to ignore. Sophia is only 7 years old when she runs into Lorenzo Duca's wedding and begs him not to marry Vivienne. She is surrounded by armed men, wealthy guests, mafia leaders, politicians, and people who have spent their lives hiding secrets behind perfect manners. Yet she stands in the middle of the aisle and speaks a truth that no adult has been brave enough to expose. This moment is deeply educational because it reminds us that children are not always confused, simply use they figured young. Euphrates remembers beers, sweeties, swears, beer, and pain. She remembers the woman who ruined her father's life and the man with the scar who stood the destruction. The adults around her may have power, but she has memory. Her courage interrupts a carefully planned lie. In real life, people often dismiss children, poor people, workers, or outsiders because they lack status. This story teaches the opposite. Wisdom can appear in unexpected places. If Lorenzo had ignored Sophia because she was just a child, he would have married into a trap and possibly lost his family empire. The education lesson is clear. Listen carefully before judging who is important enough to be believed. Truth does not become less true because it is spoken by someone small, frightened, or powerless. Sophia's bravery shows that one honest voice can stop an entire system of manipulation when someone finally chooses to listen.